Hello, welcome to Krachwerke. Today's going to be a longer one. What we're going to do is I'm going to show you how I do the acid etching onto the little aluminium enclosures for the pedals. Now, there's a lot of information that I want to get across, so there's going to be a lot of talking. So if you prefer the short content, maybe go back to TikTok, but we are going to have to chit-chat a little bit because there's a lot of things that I've realized over the few kind of acid etching enclosures that I've done that I think is useful to know, so maybe learn from somebody else's mistakes. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is explain to you kind of like the way I do it, and then kind of go through the process a bit. But first of all, I want to talk through a few things which I think is really important to understand. So there's many different ways. So let's start with this. There's many different ways of doing the acid etching. Essentially, it's all about creating a mask that leaves open some spaces, and those are the spaces that are the ones that are going to be etched away by the acid. Now, there's many different ways to create this mask. I'm going to show you the way I do it with a laser, okay? Because, well, that's just the way I do it. There are many different ways to do it. One way is to use laser printer and kind of do a heat transfer of the ink of the laser of the laser printer, which then deposits this kind of plasticky stuff that the laser printer puts on paper, but you kind of like heat transfer it. And that means that you do like a negative image, so anywhere where the little plastic ink didn't go onto the enclosure, that is the pieces that are going to be etched away. There is the more kind of professional way, dare I say, of doing it, which is using this kind of UV active kind of stuff. You know, these little films that you put up. Again, you print like a negative image, and you know, it's all of the processes are a little bit lengthy. Quick Google will show you, you know, the different options that you have. It's roughly the same as doing a PCB, etc. Anyway, the way I do it is actually fairly simple. So I bought myself a laser engraver, and any laser engraver that is kind of like more on the cheap side doesn't have the wattage to actually burn or engrave into metals, not even like brass or aluminium or aluminum. And so, but what it can do is it burns really well into most paints. So spray paints, things like that. Wood, plastics, stuff like that. So the way I do it, I basically cover the pedal in a thin layer of spray paint. The laser then burns out the image that I want, leaves the aluminium exposed, and that is then perfect for etching. But okay, let's put it this way. 80% of the battle is won the moment you have a clean mask. So a good, sharp, clean mask and well exposed and clean aluminium. Then your battle is pretty much won. After that, it's just about dumping it into the acid for however long you want to see how, you know, depending on how deep you want it to etch in. Now, there's obviously quite a few considerations here, but we'll start at the beginning. First things first, the enclosures that you buy as they come, they're a bit yucky. So what I mean by that is that they're a bit dirty, the surfaces aren't very smooth and even, they have little indents, all sorts of issues. And what you really want is you want a surface that you are putting the acid onto, which is obviously the best it can be. So really clean, really smooth, straight onto the aluminium. No dust, dirt, oil, anything like that. So what I do is I take the enclosure and I prepare it to such a degree where I would, to the point that the final product would be. So essentially, the aluminium is kind of sanded and polished and cleaned to a degree that I want the final product to be. I think that's the best way of doing it. There's a couple of things to look out for. One of them is obviously all the little burrs and stuff, sand them out. So disclaimer here, there is no way to acid etch an enclosure that isn't a shitload of tonload of fucking work, right? That's just how it is. So there's a lot of things to do to get a half decent etch. And there's also a lot of points where it can all go fucked up. So, choice is yours. Anyway, so the enclosure itself is a little bit shitty. So I usually sand it down and clean it with nail polish remover, with acetone. And then I spray a thin layer over the whole enclosure. There's a couple of things obviously to watch out for. You don't want any acid to go into the little holes and maybe eat away at the where the screws go in. The other thing is that they are not perfectly flat. They are kind of like rickety at the top. And that is something that needs to be sanded so that the surface is as flat as possible. Now that will become more apparent why that is later on, but especially in the method that I use, I think it's fairly important that it is as flat and as smooth as possible at the top. So there's a lot of work that we need to do beforehand. We need to sand it down. We need to get a nice clean aluminum surface. I would suggest when sanding it that you sand it always in one direction, so that if you have these kind of marks, that they are all in one direction. That just looks kind of more professional and neater. So what we're going to do is I'm going to prepare this, sand it down, and I'm going to cover all of it, inside and outside, back and front of the backlid as well, in a thin layer. My back plates are always kind of painted. This one won't be, but I am going to etch the logo and stuff on the back, so the back one is going to be etched. And what I'm thinking of doing with this enclosure is that I have a color all the way around, but a aluminium kind of top, brushed aluminium top, with then the engraving inside. So that's where we're going to go next. We're going to basically clean this up and spray paint back, front, inside and out. When it comes to the acid, I'll show you the acid I use. I literally bought it off eBay. It's basically pre-prepared for etching, copper or aluminium, everything. It's a very kind of low kind of powered acid. It works perfectly. You can buy it over the counter. There was no questions asked. But obviously when it comes to doing this sort of thing, you're working with corrosive material, so you have to kind of be a little bit aware of that. You maybe want to wear gloves. You maybe want to be in a ventilated area. You need to know how you need to dispose of whatever you use, because it's obviously corrosive materials and you're not going to flush it down the drain. So there's all these little things to consider, but hopefully we'll get through that as we continue. So first things first, let's get these enclosures prepared. So as with anything in this world that you want done properly, you kind of can't take any shortcuts. So what I do is I take some different grits and I really just lay into it. And like I said before, I go one way only. And the reason I only go one way is so that the brush marks are look deliberate. It's not kind of like all over the show. you can obviously, you know, polish this all the way to like a mirror finish if you want to. But I kind of like the whole brushed aluminium look. And you can obviously decide how far you want to go depending on, you know, the grit of the sandpaper. But what is important is that you have a really good clean surface. Now I don't know if this is visible, but you can see that once you start, there are different levels of it cutting into the aluminium. And that just shows you how kind of wobbly the surface is. And it is fairly important, in my opinion, to get the top as flat as possible. And that will be very apparent later on. So I'm just going to get on with this, and I'll be back once we're finished with it. So that's me putting like a brushed metal kind of look to it. And I'm going to leave it like this, because this is the look I want. So you can go as far as you want with this for whatever look you are after. But, so this is just acetone. And I'm really going to clean it. So the more kind of fine scratches you have on the aluminum, on the metal that you're using, the cleaner it is, obviously the better the paint will stick to it. So doing some kind of prep work on your enclosures, regardless if you're etching or not etching, is a pretty good idea. So once this is done, I'm really just going to put a final layer of paint that I want on the inside. Now, I'm painting the inside because it means that although we're only etching this and it'll probably just lie in the acid like this, maybe up to here, but just to protect any kind of other surface that I don't want etched from splashes and stuff, the whole thing is going to be covered in paint. I want the inside to be a color anyway. I'm not going to close these because I'm going to be careful that no acid goes in there, and I'm just going to line in there. But there you go. Right. Time to paint. So, hope you can see that properly. But that's the back plate now, completely covered, because this one is thin, so I have to kind of completely submerge it into the acid. So the back plate is going to quickly get laser etched. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to burn through the paint all the way onto the aluminium. So it takes a bit of messing about with this thing. The one thing that I really dislike about these kind of devices is that they are kind of hard to organize and center, but it is what it is. So we'll do the back plate, and then we'll also do the cover. Yeah, you can just about see where the aluminium is shining through in that first bit there. So that's making a really nice burn now. Now these were all trial and error things, how high to burn, how thin the layer of paint needs to be, all that. I mean, it wasn't like massively difficult, but it took a few trials just to make sure, like, you know, the consistency of the layer of paint is, I wouldn't say massively important, but it's a good idea to try and make sure that the layer of paint is kind of like equal all over, nice and thin, but completely covering, but equal across. So this is just the back plate quickly lasering out the information I have on the back plate, if you want to see what that looks like. It's basically just that. Okay, so sorry, but this took a while to focus. So this is a really nice burn this time. So I'm actually not gonna etch this. It's just too clean. I've noticed with the laser burner that it kind of depends on the kind of paint that you use and the color, if it burns really well or not. It has a tendency to not work really well in all colors. But what I'll show you in the next one is, like, you'll see that there's a little bit of paint left on the silver bits. And what we'll do there is we'll basically just wash it. Anyway, we'll go to the next bit. Okay, so we're now doing the cover itself, the top piece. I'm not going to explain to you how to center these things. Because I can tell you, that is something you can, like, fuck around with by yourself. It was a nightmare to find a way to properly kind of align the laser stuff when you have just a single thing putting in. They're really good for putting a big slab of something down there, cutting it out and putting a pattern on there, fine. But if you've got something that you want to engrave like this, and you want to make sure that the engraving image is exactly where you want it to be on that item, fuck me, man. Unbelievable. So anyway, so there's a lot of steps here, but at the same time, it is pretty clear that once this is done, it's done, and you can start dumping it into the asset. Most of the other methods are kind of even more time consuming to get the image actually onto the enclosure. So we're just going to wait for this to go, and then we'll get onto the asset piece. This will take around 16 minutes for this graphic. That graphic there. This is now successfully burnt. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that usually when you do the artwork, you do the artwork on your pedal after you have drilled all the holes. In this case, I would suggest it's better to do them after, because you won't have paint there and stuff that is going to be chipping. So, and also the etching can actually give you the little pilot holes already at the same time. But anyway, what we're going to do now is we just have a little bucket of lightly soaped water. And the reason is, if you look very closely, I don't know if the camera will pick it up, but there's a little bit of paint left in the recesses, just a tiny bit. And that actually comes out really well with just using some dishwater, some dish soap. To just clean that up so that you get that surface as clean as possible, so that there's no paint left between what you're going to be etching. That is pretty important. So it's already disappearing. I mean, it was a very thin layer, so it's not really still paint that's left on it. It's kind of more like a residue from the burning. And the cleaner the surfaces, now this can be water and even soapy water, that won't affect the acid. But obviously we're going to rinse this anyway with some some clean water. So that surface is now shiny. Don't know if the camera picks that up, but it is actually, considering how nice this came out, I'm not in the mood to actually etch this, but we will be doing that anyway. That's what this video is for. This came out really well. So this might just be a really nice clean etch. Yeah, I think so. It's just important that you have a really tight mask. The last thing we're going to do before we dump this in in the acid is to just inspect everything to see if there's any kind of holes that will etch through. And I'll show you how to deal with that. Let's just get rid of that. So what we're just looking for, if there's any kind of holes. So this hole here, if you can see that, there's a little bit shiny. That's actually where the pilot hole for the volume control is going to be. So that doesn't matter if that etches. In fact, that was kind of deliberate. But anywhere else where you think that paint during working with it has kind of like maybe split out. There's nothing here. This is good. No, there are two bits. Okay, so I'll show you how to deal with them. This is actually very, very simple. All you have to do is take a Sharpie to them. So I've got little dab right there. So I'm going to fill that in, and there's one here. Just cover that up. I don't see anything else. Maybe there could be a bit thin. Now, I covered them up, but if you want your etch to look like a bit gritty, right, then you don't cover them up, or you make even a few more, maybe with a little bit of sandpaper, scratch the surface a little bit, so you get these kind of random kind of etches everywhere. To make it look a little bit more kind of gritty. So if you have like a really kind of grungy style that you want, then all you really do is you keep it a little bit dirty and scratched, and that means that those pieces will also etch, and therefore it'll have a little bit more of a gritty look to it. Anyway, next step. The next step is very simple. We are just going to dump it in some acid. Now I've got a little bucket that I use for acid all the time. Please be in a ventilated area. Please know what you're going to do with the rest. But so this is the one I bought from Amazon. It wasn't expensive. It is kind of light. It's just enough to actually etch. You can use it as is. That's the beauty. There's no kind of messing around with diluting percentages or anything like that. But I would obviously suggest take every care that you can. Wear gloves, ventilated area, etc., etc. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to dump this in here. Now, because it's not submerged completely, that is why I didn't bother closing these holes. Now the problem with this is because it's upside down, you're gonna have the acid eating in and kind of covering itself up. And that's what a really shitty cheap brush is for. So every kind of 10 minutes or so, what I will do is I will go into it, I'll turn it around, and I'll brush the excess off. You will usually see that it starts kind of bubbling. Can you see the bubbles? If it's bubbling like that, it means it's etching. That's a good sign. And that is probably because the surface is so nice and clean this time. Yeah, I don't know if you can see those bubbles, but that means it's etching. Now, I have no idea how long I'm going to keep this in. The last ones I kept in all the way up to 30-40 minutes, and the etch wasn't very deep, but it was deep enough for what I wanted. So you will have to experiment with the times. And we'll come back when this is a bit more finished. So the etch is done, and it's looking pretty all right. Now you can just go ahead now and really simply just sand this off. And that's that, because this piece here that has been kind of like etched by the acid will be discolored, and it will be darker than, you know, the kind of sanded enclosure. But I want to do something different. The best way, actually I need my glasses. The best way to make it really stand out is to fill the gap. You now essentially have the top of the enclosure, and then you have a layer of paint on top of it. And the enclosure is etched in, but so is the paint. So what we're going to do now is we're going to fill this recess with a color, so that when we take this top layer of paint off, it's kind of darker. So what I was thinking of doing here was my volume, this one here, volume, the logo, and if anybody's wondering how long I left it in, it was about an hour. It was about an hour with agitating it every kind of 15 minutes, maybe a bit more. It's just part of the problem, is like you want to keep rejuvenating the surface between the acid and where it's eating, because it kind of, as it's eating it, it kind of blocks itself from with the residue that it creates. So agitating it every now and then is not a bad idea. I've always also noticed that it seems to keep the it cleaner at the edges. So obviously this edge where it's of the mask, it keeps that kind of cleaner somehow. I'm not so sure why, but that's just been my experience. So I'm going to make these black. Just to stand out a bit more. And then the other stuff will be like a red. You don't have to be too careful. The only thing I would be careful for is if your layer of paint isn't very thick, that whatever you're using, the brush or whatever is, you're not chipping. I mean, it shouldn't make too much of a difference, but you don't chip anything. Okay. This is the red I was using. I'm going to brush that in to the recess here. So the letters and the block will be kind of like a reddish. What's nice about this paint that I'm using is that it's dries really quickly. Having paint that dries really quickly means you can get on with shit, you know what I'm saying? It's this here. Audi red. So we want to make sure that this paint dries really well before we start hacking away at it again. So it doesn't kind of like come back off. Now, if you look at most of the etched enclosures, they usually, the whole idea is to get this kind of like grittiness. I've not done that this time so much because it was more demonstration, although this pedal will go up for sale. This will be one of those 32 distortions. Which have a very kind of amp-like overdrive, low distortion kind of tone to them. There's a demo. My previous video is a demo of this pedal. I had it in a small enclosure, but I hate working in the small enclosures. It's just like such a pain. So I'm making this a normal sized. But what I was referring to is like, these weren't chips. You just have to have a little micropores in your paint or in your mask. Hold on, the dog's gonna bark. All I'm doing is filling these recesses. So, Sash, there's no reason to bark, my sweetheart. No reason at all. Nobody's coming for you. It's just the postman delivering bowls. I'm going to leave it like that. Happy with that. Anyway, what I was going to say is, like, if you have little micropores, what happens is over a period of time, the acid will get underneath that micropore and start eating away underneath it, and then it'll like expand, and then you will get these chips. For an etched enclosure, personally, having that kind of gritty feel, I don't think that's a massive issue. But it will happen. It's going to be nearly impossible to stop that from happening every now and then. So we'll wait for this to dry, and then we'll sand that off. So this is the point where we basically just take some sandpaper and get rid of the layer of paint. So this is the reason why in the beginning I said it is kind of the flatter you can get this, the better. As you can see, because it's not perfectly flat, it doesn't take it off all at the same time and at the same kind of rate all over the surface, which makes it more difficult to make sure that you don't go too deep on some of these edges. So I just do it lightly and just take my time. I don't want to dig in, because when I dig in, some of these areas that are kind of taken out are kind of wide, so you might be scraping into them. We don't really want to do that. It's obvious that the middle, even though still a little bit. It's a little bit low compared to the outsides. This is fairly flat and it actually bulges a bit, so kind of shows why or how rubbish these enclosures are kind of made. So I'm going to take it easy. Once it starts going, it'll go. And I'm still only sanding in one direction. The reason for that is simple, that it has like a grain that only goes in one direction. This is gonna look snazzy. I can tell. I can tell. So anyway, I'll finish this. And I'm happy with that. So what I'm going to do now, that's pretty much it. So I'm going to drill the holes, and then after the holes are drilled, clean it and put a thin layer of varnish over everything. The varnish protects the paint, it protects the scratches. The polyurethane varnish is absolutely perfect, and it doesn't change the look of the metal. And then put this guy together. It'll look great. So let's do a little recap. This is the final product. And the back plate. So to recap, make sure you've got a way to deal with hazardous material. Wear safety equipment. I would wear glasses and especially gloves when working with the acid. Work in a well ventilated area. Maybe wear a mask. The most important part is to get a really good surface, clean surface, and that the mask is solid and clean, nice straight edges, nice clean edges. Once that's achieved, you're pretty much done. So to give you an idea, when I started this filming, this project for this filming, it was about 9:30, and it is now, it's now 2 o'clock. That's the enclosure done up to a point where I just want to varnish this and let the varnish dry and cure overnight. But that's it done. Usually it doesn't take me this quick. One of the reasons it went a lot quicker today was the paint that I used dries a lot quicker. Usually the paints, I use a certain paint on the back and stuff like that that takes a lot longer, usually like 5-6 hours before you can even touch it, and then sometimes only like a day before I would even dare to kind of laser it. But this paint is really good. I usually only used it for like, I've never used it for this basically. And so this has been good for me to know. I'll buy this brand again. I don't know what your takeaways of this. I hope this explains everything, and if there's anything you need to ask, anything that I haven't covered, please just put it down below. I'll see if I can answer it. This certainly makes for really unique looking pedals, and I love the look of it. So, and obviously this is a fairly simple design, right? I mean, you can go crazy with this and do whatever you like. So look out over the next few days. I'll complete this one and put this one up on the shop. There is a sound demo of this circuit already, the 32 distortion. Have a look at it. I'm really pleased with the tone of it. And if you like this sort of video, I used to do a lot more kind of this kind of stuff, but lately I've been doing more kind of pedal and riffs and all sorts of other things. If you like this sort of content, let me know, and please subscribe, and please check out, all the other things that are on my shop, all the other pedals. That would be great. Thank you very much.